May 7th, 2017. Bel Air, Ohio. A family dinner. Laughter around the table. Brad McGarry, 43 years old, well-liked, a coal miner by trade, sits among people who care about him. Partway through the evening, Brad stands up. He tells the table he has to go. Someone's coming by the house, he says. He'll catch up with everyone later. It's the kind of thing you'd forget by morning. A man leaving dinner early. Nothing more. Except Brad McGarry never makes it to morning. That night, his best friend, David Kinney, pulls up outside Brad's home. He's brought his wife, Cherry, and their young daughter along. Just a quick stop, dropping off a weed trimmer Brad had borrowed. They knock. No answer. The back door is open, just a few inches. David steps inside, calls out. Nothing. He heads for the basement, and that's where he finds him. Brad, lying in a pool of blood, shot twice in the back of the head. To understand what happened to Brad McGarry, you have to understand who he was. Bel Air, Ohio. A small town tucked along the banks of the Ohio River, the kind of place where everybody tends to know everybody. Brad had built his life here. By day, he worked in the coal mines. Hard, physical labor, the backbone of the region's economy for generations. But Brad wasn't a man who fit into just one box. He also had a background as a hairdresser, a trade that spoke to a different side of him, creative, detail-oriented, sociable. Those who knew him described someone with a warm, generous spirit, fun-loving, caring, the kind of person who made people feel welcome around him. He was also openly gay, in a small, conservative coal mining town where that wasn't always easy. Friends say Brad carried that truth about himself without apology, at a time and in a place where doing so took real courage. At home, Brad surrounded himself with things he loved. He collected country-style folk art, filling his house with it. He also kept a 9mm handgun, not unusual for the area, but a detail investigators would later have to account for. He had people too, a close circle of friends and family, including his cousin, Skylar Strasser, someone who spent time with him on his final day, and whose information would later prove critical to the investigation. And then there was David Kinney, best friends for years. So close that David's wife, Cherry, and their young daughter treated Brad like family, someone who belonged at their table, in their home, in their lives. By every outward measure, Brad McGarry had done something difficult and admirable. He'd built a full, connected life for himself, on his own terms, in a place that didn't always make that easy. It's the kind of life that makes what comes next even harder to understand. In the hours after Brad's body was found, David Kinney looked exactly like what he claimed to be, a grieving best friend, a husband and father, standing outside the home of a man he'd known for years, unable to hold himself together. Body camera footage from that night shows him in tears, telling officers he couldn't stop seeing what he'd found in that basement. "I'm not supposed to see that," he says. "I can't not stop seeing that." To everyone around him, to the officers on scene, to the neighbors gathering outside, to his own wife standing beside him, David Kinney was simply a man in shock. Nothing about him raised a flag. Investigators, meanwhile, had to consider every angle. One early theory centered on Brad's workplace. He'd recently moved to a new coal plant, and some wondered whether he'd faced hostility there, whether being an openly gay man in that environment had made him a target. Detectives brought in coworkers to ask directly. One of them, a former detective himself, told investigators the opposite was true. Brad was well liked. No conflicts, no enemies at work. That theory went nowhere. What investigators didn't know yet, what almost no one in Brad's life knew, was that David Kinney had another identity. Online, under the name DJ, David had spent years carrying on a secret relationship with Brad. Not a friendship, something far more complicated, and something David was determined to keep buried, especially from his wife. Brad, for his part, had grown tired of the secrecy. He wanted the relationship out in the open. David did not. Nobody investigating this case had any reason yet to look twice at the grieving man outside Brad's house. But the closer they got, the clearer it would become. The person everyone trusted most wasn't who he appeared to be at all. For years, the arrangement had held. A secret relationship, carried on in private, tucked behind the life David Kinney showed the rest of the world. But Brad wanted more than that. Investigators would come to believe that Brad had grown tired of hiding, tired of loving someone who could never claim him in daylight. He wanted David to leave Sherry. He wanted the two of them to be together, openly, without the need for a second name and a second life. For David, that request wasn't just difficult, it was untenable. Coming clean meant losing his marriage. It meant losing the family he'd built with Sherry and their daughter. It meant the community around him, coworkers, neighbors, everyone who knew him as a husband and father, would see him differently, permanently. Detectives believe Brad pushed harder than David could tolerate. That at some point, Brad made clear he was prepared to tell Cherry the truth himself, if David wouldn't. That threat changed everything. What had been a private arrangement David could manage, quietly, on his own terms, was suddenly at risk of becoming public, on someone else's terms. And in David's mind, according to investigators, there seemed to be only one way to make sure that never happened. It's worth being clear about something here. Understanding the pressure David Kinney was under does not explain away what he chose to do next. A man facing exposure has other paths available to him: honesty, separation, walking away. David Kinney chose none of them. He chose to make sure the truth died with the only other person who knew it. To reconstruct Brad McGarry's last day, investigators had to work backward, hour by hour. 1:30 p.m. Brad spends the early afternoon with his cousin, Skylar Strasser. Nothing about the visit stands out. They talk, they hang out, and then they go their separate ways. It's an ordinary Sunday. No one has any reason to think it's the last time Skylar will see him alive. Early evening, Brad is at a family dinner, surrounded by relatives, relaxed, present, engaged, until he isn't. Partway through the meal, he tells the table he needs to head home. Someone's stopping by, he says. He doesn't elaborate. No one asks him to. What people believed was happening, a man cutting an evening short for a private errand. What was actually happening? Brad was going home to meet David Kinney, the man he loved, the man he'd been pressuring to finally come clean. 6:15 p.m. David Kinney pulls into Brad's driveway. He's not alone. His wife Sherry and their young daughter are with him. The reason on the surface couldn't be more mundane. They're returning a weed trimmer Brad had borrowed. They knock. Nothing. The back door is open, just slightly. What people believed was happening. A family making a routine stop at a friend's house, about to walk into an empty home. What was actually happening? David already knew what was waiting behind that door. He'd been there before Carrie and their daughter ever arrived. Inside the house. David tells his family to wait. He goes to check the basement, alone. The 911 call comes in just after 6:15 p.m. Cherry Kinney's voice is barely holding together. "There's blood everywhere," she tells the dispatcher. "Oh my God, I'm going to throw up. My friend is dead." Dispatchers try to keep her on the line, try to get details. What they get instead is panic, raw, unfiltered, a woman who has just watched her husband's world collapse in front of her, with no idea yet how much deeper that collapse actually goes. Within minutes, patrol cars are pulling up outside Brad McGarry's home. Officers move through the house and down into the basement. That's where they find him. Brad, on the floor, shot twice in the back of the head. There's no ambiguity in what they're looking at. This isn't an accident. This isn't something that can be explained away. Outside, body camera footage is rolling. It captures David Kinney standing in the driveway, in tears, trying to speak to officers and barely managing it. "I'm trying not to freak out," he tells them. "I'm sorry. I can't not stop seeing that. I'm not supposed to see that man." To the officers standing in front of him, David looks like exactly what the scene suggests he is, a man who just found his best friend murdered. Investigators work quickly to rule things out. There's no weapon anywhere near Brad's body, which eliminates any possibility this was self-inflicted. Whatever happened here, someone else did this to him and then left. That's when Detective Ryan Aller of the Belmont County Sheriff's Office arrives on scene. Aller has worked cases before. He knows what a robbery looks like. He knows what panic looks like. And almost immediately, something about this scene doesn't sit right with him. For now, he keeps that instinct to himself. There's a family in shock outside, a community about to learn that one of their own is gone. And somewhere in this house, evidence that will take days to fully understand. But Ryan Aller has already started asking a question that will define the next 48 hours. What really happened in that basement? At first, the theory seems straightforward. A home invasion, a robbery gone wrong. But as Detective Ryan Aller moves through the house, that theory starts to fall apart. Brad's collection of country-style folk art is still on the walls. Valuable pieces, untouched. His belongings, largely undisturbed. If this was a burglary, it's a burglary where the burglar took nothing. Alar will later describe it as the most staged crime scene he'd ever encountered in his career. Someone wanted this to look like something it wasn't. Over the next 24 hours, investigators chase every lead they have. Each one goes nowhere. No forced entry that makes sense. No missing property to point them toward a motive. No obvious suspects standing out from the people closest to Brad. Then comes the break. Brad's cousin, Skylar Strasser, sits down with investigators. Skylar had spent time with Brad earlier that same day, and what Skylar tells detectives changes the entire direction of the case. There's a piece of Brad's life almost no one else knew about. A relationship, conducted largely online, with someone Brad only ever referred to as DJ. Detectives now have a name to chase. Not a real name, a username, a digital ghost. They start pulling at that thread. Messages, records, digital footprints. And slowly, DJ stops being anonymous. The identity investigators land on stops the room cold. DJ is David Kinney. The same David Kinney who called this in. The same David Kinney whose wife made the 911 call. The same man who stood outside this house in tears, telling officers he couldn't stop seeing what he'd found. In an instant, David goes from witness to suspect. Investigators briefly circle back to an earlier theory, whether Brad, as an openly gay man in a conservative community, had been targeted because of who he was. But that theory doesn't hold up against what they're now learning. This wasn't about hatred from a stranger. This was about a secret, and the person closest to Brad who needed it to stay buried. David Kinney is brought in for questioning. Up to this point, his story has been simple. He arrived at Brad's house, found the door open, went down to the basement, and discovered his best friend already dead. A witness, nothing more. But investigators now know what David doesn't realize they know. And under sustained questioning, his account starts to shift. He tells it one way, then another, then another. Reportedly, David changes his story several times over the course of the interrogation. Small details moving, timelines adjusting, pieces that don't sit still. Eventually, the story he's been holding on to gives way entirely. David admits it. He shot Brad, twice, in the back of the head. But he frames it as self-defense, a claim that he was the one in danger that night, that he had no choice. Investigators aren't convinced. If this was self-defense, a single shot in the heat of a struggle might make sense. A second shot, delivered after the first, is harder to explain away. To detectives, it looks less like defense and more like certainty, making sure the job was finished. 2 days after Brad McGarry's body was found in that basement, on May 9, 2017, David Kinney is arrested and formally charged. The best friend, the grieving witness, the man who stood in that driveway in tears, he is now the accused. Late January 2018, David Kinney's trial begins. There's little dispute over the basic facts. David's own defense doesn't try to argue he didn't pull the trigger. He did. What they argue instead is intent, that David acted in self-defense, that he was the one who feared for his life that night. The prosecution tells a different story. One built not around a single moment of fear, but around a plan. They lay out their theory for the jury. David lured Brad to that house under the promise of being together. He shot him twice in the back of the head. And then, in the aftermath, he staged the scene, arranging things to look like a robbery, untouched valuables and all, before returning later with his wife and daughter to discover the body he already knew was there. For 8 days, both sides present their case. Digital records. Testimony. The physical evidence collected from that basement. The second gunshot, still unexplained by any credible account of self-defense. On February 6, 2018, the jury reaches its verdict. David Kinney is convicted of aggravated murder with a firearm specification. He is sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The man who once stood outside Brad McGarry's house, crying for the cameras, will spend the rest of his life behind bars for what actually happened inside it. At its core, this case is about trust, and about how far someone will go to protect a secret from the people who trust them most. From the outside, Brad McGarry and David Kinney looked like an unbreakable friendship. Family dinners, weekend visits, a wife and daughter who treated Brad as one of their own. No one looking at that friendship saw any reason to question it. That's often the hardest truth in cases like this one. The person closest to a victim, the one grieving loudest, standing right there in the driveway in tears, is sometimes the one investigators have to look at hardest. But this story isn't really about David Kinney. It's about Brad. Friends remember him for his warmth, for his generosity, for a life he built on his own terms, in a small Ohio town, as an openly gay man who didn't hide who he was, even when that took real courage. He worked in the mines, he cut hair, he collected art he loved, he showed up for the people in his life, again and again. Brad McGarry spent his life refusing to hide who he was. In the end, it was someone else's secret that took him from the people who loved him.